Hi guys, this is Isaac from Contender Bicycles, and this is the Santa Cruz Hightower V3. This is the newest version of Santa Cruz's jack-of-all-trades trail bike. So Santa Cruz originally launched the Hightower in 2016, and this is now the third version of that. Originally, the Hightower had 135 millimeters of rear travel, and since then has gone through some boosts. This current model sitting at 145 millimeters of rear travel, so it has gone up, and it's now 150 millimeters of travel on the fork. We've seen plenty of changes in between the different model years, this one included. When this bike launched in 2016, it immediately became one of Santa Cruz's most popular bikes. Being the kind of jack-of-all-trades bikes they wanted it to be, it was selling well all over the country because it fit many types of terrains and riders. Originally, when they released the 2016 Hightower, the rear shock was located right there, slung underneath the top tube, but it was still powered by that VPP suspension linkage we have all loved and come to see on almost every single Santa Cruz in their lineup with the exception of the Blur. Then in 2019, it underwent its first revision, the V2. The V2 looks more similar to this bike now, where they moved that shock down here, then they increased the wheelbase, increased the reach, they steepened up the seat tube angle, they slackened out the head tube angle, and then they added 10 more millimeters of travel to the rear. This version off of the V2 version was just released in 2020 in June. This one actually looks very similar to the original V2 version. It's very close looking. They honestly, if you had both bikes side to side, you might not be able to tell the difference. The difference is very small in the geometry, some small geometry changes. They also have added this glove box. They have added a shock tunnel port so you can see your suspension layout. And then besides that, the bike has virtually stayed the same. So this Santa Cruz right here is the GX Axis kit, which comes with wireless shifting, Fox 36 fork with the Grip 2 dampener, and then a Super Deluxe Select Plus rear shock. These kits range from the bottom end, the ARC kit, at 32 pounds, all the way up to the top end kit. The X1 Reserve kit is 30.8 pounds. So you do lose quite a bit of weight in there in between those, but the bike itself remains virtually the same. Between the C and the CC versions, the only difference between the C and the CC is the frame. They use the same strength and same stiffness in the carbon, but the weight of the carbon in the CC is lighter because they use a better layup. The CC carbon was gonna lose about 150 grams off the frame alone. When you compare this to the V2 version of the Santa Cruz, the biggest difference that you can see between this bike and the previous version is this hole in the down tube right here. This is called the glove box. And you can pop the latch, open it up, and there you have your frame storage. Frame storage is now common on Santa Cruz's as of the 2023 model years, but the Hightower was one of the first bikes to get this new glove box system. Within the glove box, Santa Cruz provides two frame bags. You have the first one, which is a tool wrap, and when you open that up, there's quite a few pouches in there. I traditionally run mine with a CO2 inflator, a tubeless repair kit, and a multi-tool. You're also able to run, there's enough room in there that you could also run, like put your wallet in there, maybe some form of ID, anything like that. Maybe even your car keys could absolutely fit in there. And then the other bag they provide is a little bit longer. This one is meant to have a 29-inch tube folded up and then put inside the bag. Having a tube on you on the side of a trail is great because in case your tubeless plugger kit is not able to seal the hole is too big, you can put a tube in there and get yourself safely off the trail. But Santa Cruz has noted that this down tube storage is not meant for just these bags. You can kind of run whatever you want in there. Santa Cruz has said you could definitely fit a burrito in there, which I have not yet tested, but I will eventually. I personally found I can fit windbreakers, extra pairs of gloves in case it's cold weather and you might want a pair that's more insulated. I've been able to fit bags of gummy bears. I can get an 8.4 ounce Red Bull up in there. I've been able to get Oreo packages. So pretty much, all of your trailside necessities up inside the down tube. It's pretty awesome. They've made it implicitly clear that they want you to use the full down tube for storage, which is pretty awesome. We carry a lot of companies that do provide frame storage, but a lot of the frame storage on some of the bikes we carry is not enough for more than things like maybe one tube, one CO2, or maybe it's enough for a rear derailleur hanger or a multi-tool, but it's not a ton of room. This is by far the most room we have on a bike with down tube storage in the shop. On the non-drive side of this bike, when you look at it, you will also notice a difference between this and the previous version of the bike. There's a little hole on the non-drive side of the frame. This now lets you see into the shock tunnel and see your rear shock and see all the sag measurements on it, and it lets you measure your sag quite a bit easier. and lets you kind of know where you're sitting. So that hole has provided a lot more accessibility, and it's made it very easy for you to set up your suspension as a rider, because previously on the Santa Cruzes, the accessibility for the rear shock wasn't amazing, and a lot of people didn't set up their rear suspension super accurately because of that. But now it is way easier to do, so now you have no excuses to not run your suspension properly. With the new shock tunnel, the seat tube itself is now lower, which lets you run longer dropper posts because there's more of an insertion depth. So if you're a little bit taller, you can now run even upwards of like a 200 millimeter dropper post on an extra large and be fine because of that bigger insertion depth, which is awesome. The one downside to this though is that means that the shock tunnel itself is physically a little bit narrower, which means you cannot fit a coil shock in this new bike, and you can also not fit more air can size shocks like the Fox Float DPX2, like this one right here. It's too wide to fit inside of the bike. On this new version of the Santa Cruz V3, they did make some changes to the VPP suspension layout. The VPP suspension layout right here uses a linkage system in there, and that linkage system right now has a couple of pivots in there, and they actually have moved 2 of the pivots as compared to the old version to kind of change the leverage ratios on the shock. The new leverage ratio changes have made the suspension feel more active on the trail, so it's not quite as firm. So as you're pedaling, the small bump compliance is a little bit better, and the climbing feels a little bit more supple if your shock is not in climb mode. The other change they've made by moving the pivot is that it also has now an increased bottom out resistance. So if you were to take a really large hit, it is harder to get that shock to compress all the way through its travel due to the leverage ratios. So that means it's pretty great actually, because that means they've improved the suspension layout on both sides, on its active side and small bump compliance, and it's also improved on its bottom out resistance. This VPP suspension linkage still has a flip chip in it, just like the old version. The flip chip has a high and a low position. Most of these bikes are built in the low position, and they'll come to you in the low position. The low position has a lower bottom bracket, and it has a slacker head tube angle versus the high position. You can try it in a low or the high position. You just kind of have to take out the rear pivot, flip the flip chip back in, put it back in, re-bolt it back together. It's going to be a little bit of work, but it's nothing terrible. The high position is going to feel snappier and a little bit more maneuverable on trails, but the low position is going to feel stable at higher speeds, and it's going to be a little bit lower and a little bit more of a racier feel. I prefer my bike in the low position, but I guess it's always fun to try both. So I personally tested the large version of this bike, and between the large version of the new V3 and the V2 versions, there were some very small geometry changes. The reach got 2 millimeters longer, so something that's very, very tiny that you might not notice. The head tube got taller by 15 millimeters in a size large, so your stack height's a little bit higher, which means your handlebars are gonna be a little bit higher up. You can adjust that. If you were to lower your stem a little bit, you'd kind of negate the fact that the head tube itself did get longer. The wheelbase got minorly longer, and then the chainstays got a little bit longer. The chainstays are size specific, so they will change with you depending on what size bike you ride. The biggest change we saw on this bike by far though was the head tube angle. The head tube angle as compared to the V2 version has now slackened out by another 0.7 degrees. This seems like a really big change, but if you actually think about it in the way that this was a revamp of the bike and they only changed it 0.7, it's actually not that big of a change. For reference, the new Scott Genius got a revamp, and that changed by a full 1.6 degrees. So in comparison to other bikes that have gone a full revamp, 0.7 degrees is actually a pretty small change. So all those geometry changes might seem like the bike hasn't changed that much, but that's because Santa Cruz has kind of perfected this bike per se. They know who's riding this bike and what's it intended for, and they've kind of settled in a geometry that they found they really like and their riders also like. It's still an amazing bike and it rides very, very well. So these small little incremental geometry changes are more just small improvements. It's not a full evolution of the bike because they have found a bike that actually works very, very well as is, and there's not a whole lot to change. The Santa Cruz V3 is an amazing trail bike. It's perfect for anybody who's looking for a bike that can kind of do it all. It's kind of that one bike fleet that a lot of people look for. It's not going to be the best climber when you compare it to some cross-country bikes. It's not going to be the best descender when you compare it to other bikes like the Bronson or the Nomad, but it does everything the same. It climbs just as well as it descends. It excels in the corners, but it also does well on jump lines. You can kind of take it across everything. It will never shy away from a challenge. It may not be the easiest bike to climb with, and it may not be the fastest bike in a descent, but it can kind of do everything. That's the beauty of this bike. If you're somebody who likes to do park laps, maybe once every month or so, but you also like to do lots of cross-country base trails, but you don't mind moving a little bit slower, but occasionally you do like to take bigger jump lines or more rough trails, and you kind of end up on every trail you can think of. This bike is perfect for that. If you're not chasing super fast KOMs in either descents or the climbs, but you like to do it all, the Santa Cruz is the bike for you, especially the Hightower. If you would like to test ride the new Hightower, we do have some at our Salt Lake location here at 989 East and 900 South, if you'd want to see one in person. They are great bikes. If you have any questions about one, also feel free to call in. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you so much.